Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals and what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earl. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearl.com. In today's interview, I interview Payton Holt. Payton will soon be graduating with a master's degree in marriage and family therapy. He's currently an intern at the Marriage and Family Clinic, where he works primarily with couples. Payton hopes to continue his growth in RLT and to specialize in couples counseling and parent training. He aspires to create his own group practice where couples and families heal relational wounds, reconnect, and thrive together. When he's not doing therapy, Payton enjoys playing and watching sports, fishing, being with his family, and eating chocolate, which is something that we have in common. So without further ado, here's my interview with Payton. Well, Payton, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for having a conversation today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, so you recently did a bit of a training on RLT, and I'm interested in picking your mind a bit around the model and some of the learnings you had and some of your work with couples. And so to start with, will you just explain to the listeners what RLT stands for and like maybe some basic premises of RLT?
Yeah, sure thing. So I did just do that training. So I am a baby, not only a baby therapist, but a baby in this RLT world. RLT stands for Relational Life Therapy. The big premise there is the relationship aspect, obviously, that relational piece. So that's a big focus of the therapy is helping particularly couples. This is a fairly couple-specific therapy, helping couples to live in a more relational way, a more respectful way. So some of the basic tenets, I guess, the philosophical standing is based in feminism. There's this understanding that there is patriarchy, political patriarchy, which is, like blatant sexism, but also psychological patriarchy, which is the continuing of that, how it goes forward. And there's a couple pieces to that, recognizing that there is a really big divide between masculine and feminine traits, and that it's kind of black or white. This trait's either masculine or it's feminine. And then from there's recognizing that there's some level of contempt towards certain traits, and typically more towards feminine traits. And so masculinity is often valued higher. Similar traits that a man may have may be looked at in a negative way if a woman has them. So that's kind of the philosophical basis of this, looking at that and how it plays out, and that brings up two kind of ends of a spectrum that's really focused on an RLT. That's grandiosity and shame. And a lot of therapies do really well with shame and helping people come up out of that shame. That's part of RLT, but a big focus is also on pulling people down out of grandiosity, that one up, better than position. Yeah. So that's a big underlying framework for the therapy.
Well, there's a lot of good stuff that you mentioned there. That's really fascinating. That what you said about a lot of models have that focus on shame and how to support people in coming out of shame, but don't as often address the grandiosity. And as you were talking, I was thinking, I think one challenge, at least for me personally, and then I think it's probably common for a lot of new therapists, is how to deal with grandiosity, how to deal with patriarchy, especially within the context of couple relationships. And I
Yeah.
think even for our listeners who aren't therapists, like personally, you've got that uncle, you've got that dad, grandpa, friend who is very patriarchal, who participates in grandiosity, and from the RLT perspective, like what are some ways to engage with that patriarchy as it shows up, and how does one kind of invite that individual to step outside of that?
As an RLT therapist, um, the stance that you will take can be um, pretty directive at times. It's where we are not just a a coach, but we can be a director when necessary, to balance things out. So there is side taking that happens in RLT. We recognize that not all problems are 50-50. And so when they're not, we are joining with the one with lesser power in an attempt to rebalance that that partnership. Um, so a lot of that, the therapist needs to be authentic, show up as your authentic self, and be um, able to speak the truth as you see it, and be transparent about that. So a big piece of addressing this grandiosity that shows up is what is referred to as joining through the truth or loving confrontation. This is like literally calling out the grandiose behavior. So if that, for example, that grandiose behavior is coming out in, verbal abuse, it would be, after obviously getting some background, going through some assessment and understanding what's happening, at some point you would actually call that out and tell the person you are a verbal abuser. What's that like to hear? And then be able to process that. And it sounds really confrontational, but when it's done right, it's actually really empathetic,
Hmm.
because you're able to go into some of their family of origin and talk about how, you are a good person, but you're behaving really indecently. And it's, a lot of it, this is what you've learned from your own experience. So it's holding that piece of empathy and understanding while still confronting the grandiose behavior.
Mm. It reminds me, I had a recent podcast conversation with my grandpa and my dad. I don't know if I told you, but they're both therapists, marriage and family therapists, and they talk about
Yeah,
care fronting is what they're calling it, and yeah, calling out that power, that criticism, defensiveness, as it shows up, and so it's this um, empathic and yet confrontational uh, approach, and so you're saying there you're taking sides with the person with less power, and is it mostly done through what you were sharing there with uh, speaking to that power, acknowledging that, and processing that with that person, or are there other ways one might join the person with less power?
yeah, good question. So oftentimes what comes up, and this is a like the way RLTs kind of framework your perspective, is you're looking at who's the blatant in the relationship and who's the latent. The blatant is typically the grandiose person, the person that you wouldn't want to live with, that is um, oversharing or being controlling, taking that power stance. And the latent is the one who's typically withdrawing. So you can kind of see it as this their own perspective of the pursuer withdrawer kind of pattern. And what the to really start working with this system, you want to empower that person in that latent position. So similar to how EFT starts with the withdrawer and bringing them back, you want to bring that latent person into the conversation, give them a voice, bring them power. That's done through the actual sessions when you're intentionally giving them time and opportunities to voice while quieting the other partner. And that's also through boundary work and helping that the latent person actually start to create boundaries and stop acting as though everything is okay in order to live a more, as we would say, relational life.
Sure. And is it always analogous then to the pursuer withdrawer with the latent and what's the other term?
Blatant.
Blatant and latent positions?
Not always, and not in every case is there a blatant and a latent.
Okay.
Um, so we recognize that that doesn't always show up, but typically, generally speaking, that pattern will come up in the couples that you see.
Sure. Well, and I'm curious, just having started practicing RLT with, I know you're primarily seeing couples, like what have you been noticing
Mm-hmm.
has been working that you've been applying with what you've learned with RLT that seems to be the most like practical thing for you with what you've learned?
Yeah. I'd say there's two things that stand out in particular. One is the trauma work that gets done with RLT, and a lot of it is based on insight, going into the family of origin and really exploring um, what people saw and grew up with. And, as part of confronting some of these dysfunctional behaviors that might be inhibiting a relational life, you're asking questions like, who did you see do this? Um, who did this to you? Or who did you do this to? And who didn't stop you from doing that?
Hmm.
And so going into some of that background and connecting today's patterns to yesterday's um, examples and experience. So I found that to be really,
Yeah.
really helpful for people to start to make those connections and start to address some of the trauma. Because I mean, I've been, I guess I've been a little surprised by how much trauma there is in almost everybody's background in
Yeah.
one way or another. Um, and so that's been a really helpful piece. And another piece that I find to be really helpful is the relationship grid, and this is a kind of a diagnostic tool that's used that brings in that grandiose and shame based behavior, but also brings in boundaries, walled off and boundaryless. So you're literally making a grid, grandiose on the top of the y-axis, shame on the bottom, walled off on the far left of the x-axis, and boundaryless on the far right. And you're walking couples through identifying where they go when they're at their worst. What quadrant do they
Mm.
end up in? Are they in a walled off, grandiose kind of state when they're the worst with each other? Do they
Hmm.
go to a shame-based, boundaryless kind of a place? And so this is a really helpful tool in um, uh, diagnosing the dance that the couple gets in, because it's gets into the more, the more you go into a grandiose, boundaryless place, the more your partner goes into a shame and walled off place, and vice versa.
Ah.
So it's really diagnostic, but it's also prescriptive, because the couples get to visually see where they need to go to get back to the place of health, because health is somewhere in the middle of that grid, where you have appropriate boundaries, but you're not walled off, you're not grandiose, you're not shame based, you're in a place of same as, where you see other people as the same as yourself. So depending on where you fall on that grid, you know where what you got to do to get back to the center.
Oh, I really like that. I just started to draw it out on the piece of paper I've got in front of me. So it's shame and grandiosity on the y axis, grandiosity on the top, and it's walled off on the left side of the x axis,
Yes.
walled off, and then it's what's the other end? Walled off and
Bound Boundaryless on the far right.
boundaryless. Okay. Yeah, and then you're able to kind of map, and you're mapping this when you're at your worst. You're saying you in the heat of an argument, you're flooded. Where do you fall? And then that then gives you that information for, okay, next time I'm in an argument with my partner, maybe even friend, anyone. I know where I'm trying. I know what I'm trying to adjust there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's also helping the client identify that, what we call adaptive child response. It's this unconscious response. When you're flooded, when you're triggered, that's kind of your knee jerk reaction to go to that place. And so we label that as the adaptive child. And that's part of the trauma work, is addressing that adaptive child, where that came from, how it benefited you in the past, but how it's costing you now, and getting into working towards getting to a place of the wise adult or functional adult.
Hmm. Oh, that's good. And are there then any tools or ideas you have for supporting people who maybe they're let's just do the example of like they're grandiose and more walled off. Like d- any ideas for like what pieces of advice or like support you might give a person who falls in that category?
Yeah, it's fairly straightforward in the sense of um, really trying to catch yourself in those moments. It's all about getting into another level of consciousness. So um, it's recognizing what it's like when you're there. So I guess this would
Mm,
apply to all different quadrants. But
yeah.
what's the feeling that comes up in your body? Because there's going to be a feeling with that. And then what kind of thoughts are associated with that? And starting to basically recognize that pattern and those thoughts and behaviors associated with going into that place. And if you're in a walled off place, there needs to be some either responsible distance taking or intentional turning back. And when I say responsible distance taking, I mean communicating when you need a break, because a lot of people fall into this "I'm flooded, I'm out of here" kind of
Yeah.
pattern, and they just
Yeah.
walk away, or they just uh, stonewall. But that a more responsible distance taking would be something that's like, look, here's how I'm feeling, I need to step away, this is why, and here's when I can come back.
Mm, yeah. That's I really like that language too, responsible distance taking, because it's often that other person is more in that pursuing role when one partner is more walled off, and just leaving that person there, with all of the fear that likely they're experiencing, of fear probably potentially around that person leaving them, is then
Right, right,
fueled in that moment, and they don't they people often say they really value that reassurance. So that, yeah, I appreciate that piece of, okay, I know I need distance right now. I'm going to tell my partner what's going on for me. Having that curiosity piece that you're talking about. Okay, what's my experience? Communicating what you can about that. And then I need some space. Can we come back in 20, 30 minutes? Um, I imagine some people, do you give recommendations around like a time limit, because I know certain people might say like, okay, we'll come back in 3 or 4 days, right? And talk about, and I think the partner who's more pursuing probably wouldn't be too happy about that. So
right,
is there like a time frame that you kind of
right.
invite people to set up there?
Yeah, I mean, I often I frame this in a place of what's going to work for you two. But I do encourage some pattern of check-in, maybe 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, then a day, with the recognition that maybe you're not ready at that time period. That's why it can be a check-in. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and
that's good.
part of that responsible distance taking is if you're not ready, stating so and going to the next check-in period. But yeah, I definitely encourage people to get back to it within a day.
Sure, sure. Well, and I'm curious to hear more about. Yeah, I know you've been working with a lot of couples, Payton, and I'm curious, maybe within RLT or outside of RLT, like what are some uh, things that you've been finding helpful in your work with couples, or like what have been some like pivotal moments for you, whether it's person of the therapist, or whether it's just like insights about like couple dynamics, or helpful interventions for couples, like as you're kind of looking back on these initial like stages of your training, like what have been some uh, things that kind of leap out as important things that you like to keep with you as you work with couples?
Yeah. So two particular like interventions that I think have been really impactful for me and for some of the couples I've worked with are recognizing losing strategies. And these are similar to Gottman's Four Horsemen, the losing strategies, looking at like withdrawal, control, retaliation is a big one that I really am glad that one's identified on there because I've seen that come up in a lot of couples. This yeah, this idea that I'm going to hurt you because you hurt me.
Uh,
So pointing those out, um, and and helping the the couple identify what their losing strategies are, and also having them take some consideration of what they think their partner would think their losing strategies are,
yeah,
and getting some reflection in that. So that's been a really good one. I think that uh, sticks with people. I mean, I'm thinking of a session I just had a week ago where we went through these losing strategies, and I checked in with the couple this week just to follow up on that conversation. And the wife was like, yeah, I've actually been thinking about this every day since we've had this discussion and realized
mm,
that the way I retaliate, it doesn't just show up in my relationship. It shows up in my work. It shows up with my friends. And she's actively trying to make changes now that she sees that.
Hmm.
And it was cool because she got feedback from coworkers just over this past week that like, oh, something's changed about you. You seem happier.
Wow.
And so yeah, it was awesome to see that grabbing onto this concept is helping her actually make real changes. Yeah, so there's that insight focus, but then there's this behavior focus too, making actual changes. And I was just starting to talk about how, as an RLT therapist, you see character as something that's changeable, that can be molded and developed and grown rather than you're stuck in these character traits. So that becomes an important piece of helping people continue their own personal and individual development.
Uh, oh, that's good. And I had a curiosity when you present these uh, r- losing strategies. Do you generally say here are some common losing strategies that other couples, contend with? Kind of like the four horsemen: criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling,
Mm.
and then you were saying retaliation. Or like how do you generally engage a couple in that losing strategies conversation?
Yeah, so RLT has identified five particular losing strategies, and that's what I focus on. So the five are being right, control, retaliation, withdrawal, and unbridled self-expression. So I will talk about these, define them, and then go through an exercise where the couple takes time to evaluate what they think their losing strategies are.
Oh, that's good. And would you mind getting most of them seem pretty straightforward to me, but the unbridled self-expression, would you say a bit more about like how that shows up in people's lives?
Yeah, so that unbridled self-expression is related to that boundaryless place on that relationship grid. That's unbridled self-expression is um, when you feel like everybody needs to know all of your thoughts and opinions on some certain matter, or the kitchen sink kind of argument where you bring up every semi-related hurt from the past, throwing in every piece, or um, being I guess that kind of would go into retaliation a little bit, but being hurtful with the things that you're expressing.
Hmm.
um, yeah, the stance is that some things don't need to be said. They're you don't have to just word vomit on everybody all the time. That's having a lack of a boundary of controlling yourself.
Hmm. And that I imagine that can go hand in hand with the grandiosity piece.
Yeah, it can. Yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
and then it's so with the RLT, it's as a therapist too, you're pointing out these moments where you're seeing these losing strategies in the room. I would take it.
Yeah, yeah. So you've helped the couple identify what it is for them, and then that's a basis for continued groundwork. Checking in, how did this come up between you two in this last week? What did you do about it? And yeah, and if you're seeing it in the room, calling it out in the room, and helping the couple find a new dance step that doesn't follow that
Yeah.
losing strategy.
And I'm curious, what are some of these dance steps that you've seen? Are there like Well, does RLT say there's like a winning strategies too, or is that just more subjective in how each person steps away from the losing strategies?
Yeah, and there are winning strategies that RLT has identified. There's 5 or 6 of those to help move the couple into a more positive place. So it's you know this losing strategy piece is connected to some of the trauma work because it's often how they're losing strategies is what they saw as kids. So it fits into some of that trauma work, but then also fits into this educational piece of how to move forward and bringing in some of those winning strategies. So the RLT does take a pretty educational approach with this assumption that couples don't know how to be relational. That's why they're coming to see you. A lot of times based on their past history, they don't have any good examples of what it means to be in a respectful relational place.
Yeah. And is it fair to say too that like RLT is suggesting that the power of patriarchy that we talked a bit about is a major component there as well in getting in the way of that relational connection?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because it doesn't. I mean, if, speaking like a heterosexual couple, you have a male and a female in the relationship, but the psychological patriarchy doesn't have to be going from a man to a woman. It can go from woman to woman, or woman to child, man to child. Like it, there's all the different configurations of how this psychological patriarchy gets um, passed on and impacting relationships. So yeah, it's definitely fair to say that that's an important piece of this process.
Hmm. Oh, that's good. Well, is there anything that we haven't touched on, Peyton, that is in the back of your mind that you want to share? And it could really be anything within the realms of psychotherapy.
Um, there's one more intervention that I've it has helped me personally,
Hmm.
and I really like giving to couples. It's called the feedback wheel, and it follows a speaker listener kind of pattern, but it has some pretty rigid rules, and these rules make it so um, concise and helpful for a couple to share feedback with each other.
Hmm.
Um, so I'd love to just kind of briefly run through what that feedback wheel looks like,
Oh,
if that's okay.
please. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so speaker role has 4 different steps to follow. First is identifying your experience. So when you're giving feedback to your partner, what is it that you experienced? And this is like observable stuff. If a video camera can't record it, then you're not in the right place.
Sure.
I heard you scream and you said these things, and I saw you slam the door, that kind of stuff. Second step is what I made up about it. So it gets to this internal narrative. And here's what I told myself when this happened. Third step is how I felt about it or how I feel about it, and really specific to an emotion. I felt angry, I felt sad, frustrated, disappointed, getting something towards an emotion. And then the last step is what I would like for you to do about this to make it better now or better in the future. And all of this should take place in no more than 8 sentences. It should be really concise and specific. And then I think the biggest power of this is in the listener's role,
Hmm.
because as a speaker, those are pretty easy things to identify, to work through, and then the the real power from this intervention comes through the listener's role. And the listener has some important steps to follow too. First step is to own what you can. That kind of relates to the experience that the speaker shared. Did you yell? Did you say those things? Were you 15 minutes late? Own that. Own what you can. Second step is to show understanding. So this is where the validation or empathy or reflection can come into play, where you're showing that you get why your partner made up that story, why they were feeling that way. Third step, and this is more of just something for the listener to remember, is you don't argue your partner's experience. That's their experience. You don't argue that. Last step is give what you can. So with that request, you want to respond with generosity. What can you give? If your partner requested 3 things and you feel really comfortable giving 1 or 2 of those, talk about that. Don't focus on what you can't give, but hit on what you can, and be generous with what you can. And that's it. Like end of conversation. There's no, that the end. And if you want to take a turn, you can do so at a later time, but not right then.
Okay. If the listener wants to then give feedback, it's recommended to wait a period of time, and then you can be in the listener or speaker posture with the feedback wheel.
Yeah, exactly. Especially for the couples beginning with this and trying it out, because it's meant to be pretty rigid and make it that almost a one-way street, in sense of the speaker gets to speak, listener listens, and there's no defensiveness, there's no rebutting what was said. It's following those steps, and the interaction's over.
Well, Payton, we're getting to the end of the interview here, and I'm wondering, so a question I always like to ask at the end is, what's a message of hope you'd like to leave the listener with?
Yeah. And biggest thing is, I guess, that change really is possible. If you want to make changes in your life, you can. You have the power to do so. You are not stuck if you don't want to be. And there's so much life to live, especially relationally. I mean, that's where our joy comes from, is in our relationships. And there can be so much joy when you're able to find your voice, find some boundaries, and get into a good place of same as it. Yeah, totally transforms your relationships, and brings all new meaning to them. So yeah, that's my voice of hope, is that as long as there's a flicker of desire to change, you can do so.
Oh, that's a good one. Change is possible. You can change. Yeah, that's good. And if people want to get in touch with you, Payton, where'd be a good place to direct them?
Great question. I don't have my own website or anything cool like that. I guess I could give you my email address. That's a way that I can be reached. That is D as in David, dpayton.holt @gmail.com.
Perfect. I'll put that in the show notes. And thanks for being on the podcast today, Payton.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.